questions. No, just kidding. I was thinking actually during that, and extra pressure of it being live and on camera, just turn the camera around to you all. But it's an incentive to ask questions next time. But no. Instead, if you have any questions, I can take them down for next time. Right now, my tentative plan is to continue doing this for the next maybe 2 or 3 weeks and then move on to a regular series. But just give a little more opportunity if you have that burning question. But any questions that occur to you now, because I know sometimes it's just a matter of like not remembering the question at the right time when you can send it. So
now we know the question is going to come.
Yeah. Always there's one more there.
Sure.
The people in this church are very vicious and mean. That would be
On the street,
No, that's a good point. Hey, if you want, why don't you put it in the offering basket if you want to put a question in, just so we have a way to do that today. But yeah, we can do that. All right. And again, you can send it throughout the week. And if you don't like today, I get to pick. And so today we're going to do something a little different. It'd still be kind of a question, but we're going to look at what is the point of the book of Jonah. And look at the book of Jonah. The whole book is the intent is not an easy book to find because it's short and it's in the minor prophets. But it's right after Amos.
It's in the Old Testament?
In the Old Testament, yeah. And as we go along, again, this is more informal here in Sunday school. So yeah, as we go through it, if you have any questions, feel free to bring those up. Your opportunity to talk about the book of Jonah. And we'll just get started, go through, see what points, and to see what is the intention of this book. What point does it want us to get across, and how does it communicate that point? Jonah himself was a prophet who's mentioned in 2 Kings during the it references a prophecy that he gave that was fulfilled in the days of King Jeroboam II. So most people place him during the time of Jeroboam II, although if you think about it, it actually just means that he didn't live any later than King Jeroboam II. We don't know when the prophecy was given. But so usually he's dated, though, to around, let's say, 780, 790 BC, so maybe even, earlier. Again, we mostly know that he wasn't any later than King Jeroboam, and King Jeroboam reigned from about 793 to 753. So that half of the 700s. Now, Assyria is where Jonah's going to end up going, and Assyria would conquer Israel, but that happened later, more like 721. So we're maybe a couple generations prior to that, which was somewhat of a downtime for Assyria. It wasn't an immediate threat to Israel. In fact, Israel had benefited from Assyria attacking Syria, which had been attacking Israel. But they were still one of the Gentile nations, one of the pagan nations, someone that was more distant from Israel, and we'll see some of that reflected in this book. So let's start at the beginning. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." Now we'll see this same phrase used in chapter 3, and that's significant, but this is the way it comes to a prophet. The word, the message is given him, and he's told to go to Nineveh and to call out against it. So there's the evil of Nineveh has come to God's attention. He's going to judge Nineveh, but he wants to send a prophet to call out against it. Now, why would he send out a prophet to call out against it? Why wouldn't he just judge it? Why do they need the extra heads up that judgment is coming? They wouldn't, if the point was only to judge Nineveh, you wouldn't need to send prophets to tell them that. You could just to God would get more glory, I suppose, that they know that it was judgment coming upon them. So we'll get more of the intention as we go along. But first we find he's told to call out against Nineveh. Then it says, very curiously, but Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. We're not told at this point why he flees. A lot of times prophets are hesitant to go on a mission, whether it's Jeremiah or Isaiah or Moses, and they all have their different reasons for hesitating. So we're not told immediately why Jonah goes to flee to Tarshish. So if we're reading this for the first time, we're thinking, that's curious. And so it's going to draw you into the story a bit and tell you later on what his reasons were for fleeing. But he flees from the presence of the Lord. He wants to get away. Goes down to Joppa, finds a ship, goes to Tarshish, pays the fare. And notice also in this passage, you have a certain word that is used repeatedly to indicate something about what Jonah is doing. It says that he went down to Joppa, because Joppa is a lower elevation, and he found a ship. And he paid the fare and went down into it, that is into the ship, to go with him to Tarshish. And later on, it says, as the ship comes up, Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. And then later on, we're going to find that he goes even further down into the ocean. So there's this repeated focus here in the first part of Jonah that God catches up to him. And we find one theme of the book of Jonah, and that's God's sovereignty over everything. How does the sea come about? The Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. There's a mighty tempest, and the ship threatens to break up. God's going to send a lot of things. It's interesting, a lot of the people that deny the historicity of Jonah, they'll just say this was a story that was told to make a point. Well, and these things aren't realistic. We don't have to take them as literal events. That's rather incredible that a fish would swallow Jonah and all of that. Well, one of the points of the book of Jonah is that God is sovereign over all the natural events that take place. He can destroy cities. He can send a fish. He can send a storm. He can, that's part of the point, the truth that the book communicates. So we can't get the truth without also having the history, or at least we won't have any reason to not fast asleep. Now, the sailors are crying out to their gods. They want Jonah to cry out to his God. And they're going to cast lots, and the lot falls upon Jonah. And when they ask Jonah more about who he is, we have some irony. Apparently, he has told them, we've seen in verse 10, he's already told them that he's fleeing from the presence of the Lord, but apparently he's held back some important details about the nature of this God that he's fleeing from, because they have to ask him, what is your country? What's your occupation? What people are you? And he says, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Well, does he? Does he fear the Lord? Well, if he does, he fears him in the wrong way. He's trying to escape from him, but he's not fearing him in the way that the sailors are now going to fear God, fearing God. What is this that you have done? They know that's not a good idea. If this is the God who's the God of the heavens, who made the sea and the dry land, what was Jonah thinking about sailing on a ship to get away from him if he's the God who made the seas? And so he's kind of exposing himself in his very good confession of faith, but his actions weren't really matching his confession. That's something that happens a lot for us as well. And so they wonder what to do, and Jonah volunteers to be hurled into the sea, since it's on his account that this is being sent against them. The sailors, though, are very admirable. They try to row back to land. They don't want to be guilty for this man's life. They are fearing God. When they finally do throw Jonah out into the sea, they pray to God, not only to God, but notice Lord, capital letters, which refers to Jehovah, to Yahweh, the Israelite God, the true God. Let us not perish for this man's life, for you've done as it had pleased you. So they picked Jonah up, hurls him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. And then note again in verse 16, word that we've seen before, the men feared the Lord exceedingly. And they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. This is a pretty remarkable, I would call it a conversion. You have the fear of the Lord. You have a seeking the mercy of the Lord. You have offering a sacrifice to the Lord, and they make vows. Like, when we get back to shore, I will be yours. I will sacrifice to you. I will worship at your temple. That is the type of vow that people would make. So Jonah didn't want to call out against Nineveh, but now God is still saving Gentiles regardless of Jonah's intention. He's going to have compassion, whether Jonah wants to or not. So Jonah is thrown into the sea. What would they expect throwing him into the sea? What would be the expected outcome of throwing him into this raging sea? What did the sailors fear?
The guy would judge them for doing so.
For doing what?
For killing Jonah, basically.
So they're expecting he's going to die,
Yeah.
right? They're expecting he's going to drown, right? And I think sometimes we miss that that's the danger, and that the fish is actually God rescuing Jonah. If you've seen the VeggieTales Jonah, which is actually pretty good in many respects, but they make it like he's thrown out there and everything gets calm, and then they're like, oh, maybe we should bring him back in, and then the fish swallows him, like the fish is the big bad guy. But if you look at the prayer in chapter 2, Jonah is praying this prayer of thanks from the belly of the fish. And he describes how he had gone down into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the waves are coming over him, and he feels like he's going down to Sheol, to the place of the dead, and yet he's rescued from death by God, and he's saying this while he's in the fish's belly. So the Lord is showing mercy to Jonah by appointing a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Of course, it's also a mercy that it was a fish that was capable of keeping Jonah for 3 days and 3 nights. Of course, there's a lot of discussion about what was the fish, what type of fish was this? Is this one that still is around today? We don't know, but it was a great fish. We don't have to limit it to a fish and not a whale, because they didn't use the same categorization of fish. Some have said a great white shark, some have said a whale shark. The New Testament, when it talks about Jonah, and we're actually going to come to that in our sermon text today, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Jonah, is that it uses a Greek word, ketos, which is not the normal word for fish. It's more a specific word, which would be more like sea monster, which would be more like could be a great fish, but it was also used for like sea serpents and dragons and things like that in the ancient world. And if you look at early pictures of Jonah in synagogues and things like that, the type of thing that they imagined was a lot more like a sea serpent than a whale shark. Again, that's the word that Jesus, well, at least Matthew translating Jesus, chose to use to describe it. Whether it's an extinct animal or a fish that we have today, in any case, God appointed a great fish, something that would not have been. People in the day knew that there were great fish out there, but God appointed a specific one to swallow up Jonah and to preserve him for 3 days and 3 nights. Any questions so far? Anything we've talked about? Yes.
Just a comment that I think there were records of whalers who lost men in the sea and caught a whale and cut it open. A man was still alive inside.
Yeah.
Japanese sailor, I think.
There's a couple, and again, it's not as reliable as Jonah because sailors come up with fish stories, but there have been a couple well-publicized, events where such things seem to have happened. I think I was reading with the great white shark that they have multiple stomachs, and so like the digestive juices wouldn't happen immediately, and they don't digest things right away. So there's things that we could use to explain it plausibly, but similar to how I talked about the whole historicity, depending on the point of the story, which is that God is sovereign over all of these things, is that whether it was a natural thing or miraculous thing, God was able to appoint the right type of fish with the right process to keep Jonah. Didn't mean that maybe when Jonah came out that he looked affected by it. One thing I think is going to be somewhat assumed in Matthew's account is that the people in Nineveh were aware of Jonah coming out of the whale. You know, whether it was people witnessing it and then the report spreads, or whether just Jonah looks really weird, you know, having been inside a whale for 3 days, and so he ends up telling that story as part of his proclamation. It seems like the sign of Jonah being come out of the fish had something to do with the people's response to the preaching.
You could smell fishy. And your whole house smells like a fish if you make a small thing.
And even if it wasn't still around when he got to Nineveh, because that was like 400 miles away, people along the way would have realized something was up. And a lot of the people's worship gods that had to do with great fish. And so if you realize this God that he's proclaiming is sovereign over the fish that spit him out, you could see why there could be a little more, you would pay attention to him. So he prays this prayer from the belly of the fish. He describes his experience much like the death and resurrection. Whether or not he did in fact die, I don't think so, but some people will say, well, he could have died in the whale and God resurrected him. I guess he could have. But again, I think the main point is that he was delivered by the fish, and he's remembering God. He's realizing that those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. God's salvation belongs to the Lord, and he's grateful for this salvation, for the compassion shown upon him. And what I vowed, I will pay. He rededicates himself to the Lord to serve him, and so the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out on the dry land. See, now the time is ticking. I might have to speed up my pace a little bit. But notice at the beginning of chapter 3, the same word is used. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. It's emphasizing the point that God is giving him another chance and is sending him yet again. And Jonah now arises and goes. It's a great city. We found archaeologically that it was a great city, at least as big as is described here. 3 days' journey in breadth that could include some of the suburbs of Nineveh as well. But it was one of the great cities of the ancient world at that time. He proclaims a message of judgment. In 3 days, Nineveh will be overthrown, and they believe God. They put on sackcloth, they repent. The king of Nineveh is in many ways like the sailor on the ship. You notice his speech ends with the same phrase, so that we may not perish. That he fears God and he seeks God's mercy. They have a fast. They, as a people, can turn from their evil and hope that God will turn from the evil that he intends for them. I haven't pointed it out, but one word that's used throughout is the word for evil, which can both mean moral evil as well as disaster, which is often sent upon people for their evil. So if they turn from their evil deeds, God might turn from the disaster that he would send upon them. And God sees it, even though it wasn't expressed in that message against Nineveh, it was implied, and disaster he would said to do to them, and he did not do it. So you would think that would be the end of the story. God wanted to send Jonah to Nineveh, and while he resisted for a time, he finally got Jonah to Nineveh, and Nineveh repented, and judgment was turned away. Now, why do we have another chapter? What has not yet been explained in the book of Jonah?
Jonah, why he didn't want to go to Nineveh in the first place.
Right. That part of the story has not been concluded, which I think is pointing to the fact that while there's other points to be made in this account, that is a main part, perhaps the main point of the story. It has to do with why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh, and the point that God's going to make in the 4th chapter. It displeased Jonah exceedingly. In other words, it was evil to Jonah. Same word there. He was angry. And now we get the answer. And he prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster." reciting, again, a very important creedal statement from Israel, which had been recited back in Exodus 34 and is picked up in many Psalms, but now it's a complaint that Jonah knew that God was this way, and that if the message was proclaimed, that he would show mercy to these Ninevites, and they would not get what they deserved. He's almost like that character in Les Mis, always pursuing and not relenting, and that's kind of like Jonah in this. He doesn't want mercy to be shown. He, in fact, says, Lord, take my life. It's better for me to die than to live. The Lord questions him, do you do well to be angry? Well, Jonah goes out of the city, sits on the outside, sees what's going to happen, just in case, something's going to happen to the city. And God teaches him a lesson with a plant. Probably a castor oil plant is what I've heard it described, but a plant that God, again, appoints, just like he appointed the fish and the storm and the disaster. Now he appoints a plant, and it comes over Jonah to save him from evil, from discomfort, in this case, is the idea of that word. And so Jonah is exceedingly glad because of the plant. But then he appoints a worm that attacks the plant, and it withers. The sun rose. God appointed a scorching east wind. He appoints that too, that wind, which now makes Jonah very uncomfortable. And so he says, it's better for me to die than to live. And so now God says, you do well to be angry for the plant. Now notice now, instead of being angry for instead of being angry for compassion being shown, now he's angry out of compassion for this plant, that it's been destroyed. And now God turns the tables on him. Do you do well to be angry for the plant? Yes, I do well to be angry enough to die. And the Lord said, you pity the plant, but you didn't labor for it. You didn't make it grow. It came into being in a night, vanished with the night. It was rather insignificant. You didn't have any investment in this plant. I merely gave you some comfort. Should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons, God made, I should add, who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? And that's the end of the book. Very dramatic way of ending the book. You don't get any epilogue, and Jonah learned his lesson and went back home, and should not God do that? Should I not pity Nineveh? And should we not also pity Nineveh? Should we be like Jonah? Or should we not be like Jonah and learn the lesson that God is teaching? And also much lingers with a question there. Emphasizing that is, I think, the point of Jonah. There's a lot else said in it. God is sovereign over all things. He desires to see all nations saved and come to repentance. He is a merciful God, and I think that is where it leads us. He is a merciful God, and we ought to be merciful to others as well. So, any questions before we wrap up this time then about the book of Jonah?
There's a lot in this short little book that you really point out. But one of the first things that come to my mind is Psalms 1. It says, blessed that does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, does not stand before sinners or something like that, and then does not sit among scoffers. And you see that progression downward as you become comfortable with the wickedness. It kind of reminded me of that where Jonah kept going down, comfortable maybe. But it's a problem in our lives when we run from the presence of the Lord. Not that you can actually do that, but if you run from the presence of the Lord, you start finding that progression downwards. The other thing, too, Jonah seemed to fail to understand his own wickedness. It's hard to sometimes want to witness to people who are just very vile and evil, and we forget that apart from God, we could be there going out, there go out.
Right. Yeah, he should realize he was shown mercy by God when he directly disobeyed God. Yeah.
And he also, besides seeing God's sovereignty, which is certainly here, and seeing His mercy, which is certainly here, we see His great patience, giving Nineveh time to repent. You're giving them Jonah, and you finally got Jonah there. You see God orchestrating it. Give them great patience. Or God had great patience for the wicked.
Mhm.
And God's decree, and it doesn't mention here, but we know that God decreed all things. So God had decreed this whole situation, sovereignly orchestrating it so that the people on the ship would evidently, I guess, come to the Lord, and Nineveh certainly, plus working in Jonah's life, out, which he does to all of us.
Right.
Use a plant. I've always heard before. What's the word?
Yeah, it's probably the castor oil plant is the plant being referred to. I mean, Hebrew or just can't pronounce it very well from what they have here, but yeah, ESV has a plant and then has the footnote to try to be more specific. I think the gourd is trying to be more specific, but not too specific, but yeah, it's just a matter of the translator deciding how narrow do I want to be, trying to pinpoint this word. And the ESV went with a more general translation. One thing I did want to mention, I forgot when we were going through it. Notice Jonah's fleeing from the presence of the Lord. He's fleeing. Where is it? In his prayer. In verse 4, I shall again look upon your holy temple. And my prayer came to you in your holy temple. The idea that he realizes that he's trying to go from the presence of the Lord, and that ends up being a bad thing, that he feels like he's out of the reach of God's mercy too, and yet God hears him from his temple, that he's not out of reach of God's judgment, but he's also not out of reach of God's mercy, and that even though he had tried to flee from the presence of the Lord, he was yet heard by God in his holy temple. All right. Well, yes.
I mean, it's curious because it must be using temple in its more spiritual sense. Because Jonah was from the northern kingdom and the temple was in the southern kingdom, right?
Well, as a faithful prophet, I think he would have recognized that the right temple was in the south.
Okay.
It still could be that he's thinking about his heavenly temple. I don't know that he thought that he had a telephone and his voice was speaking in the physical temple in Jerusalem. But I think when he flees from the presence of the Lord, he's probably thinking the presence of the Lord being in Jerusalem, in the temple. And that's going to Tarshish is going geographically away from that. But yet God who dwells there is still able to hear Jonah, even though he was in the seas in the Mediterranean. All right. Well, we'll come up to Jonah again in the sermon as we find Jesus referring to him. But let's close up the recording then and get ready for worship.